Volunteers, please rearrange the stage. Manoj, I'll just. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Yunus. আমরা সমৃদ্ধ হলাম, যেতে দেওয়ার ইচ্ছে নেই কিন্তু যেতে দিতে হবে। আমাদের পরবর্তী সেশনের জন্য আমরা তৈরি। Ladies and gentlemen, we are delighted to welcome back Adrian Levy to Kalam. A few of you may have attended his session on the Taj incident in Mumbai, based on his book, The Siege. This year, Adrian Levy and Sunetra Choudhury will be discussing crime, punishment, and chronicling sensational news stories in their recent books. Crime and punishment are topics that have always drawn us. We need another chair on stage, please. Can we clear the area around the stage? আপনাদের সবাইকে বলছি দয়া করে যদি স্টেজের পাশটা একটু পরিষ্কার করে দেন তাহলে আমাদের পরের সেশনটা শুরু হতে পারে। Okay, that was smooth. একটা চেয়ারই হবে, থ্যাংক ইউ।
Good afternoon, friends. Can you all hear me? Uh, so this book, Behind Bars, is Sunetra's book released mid 17, mid 17. It chronicles the story of 13 people incarcerated for a variety of crimes across different jails, including Tihar, Arthur, and a juvenile home. Adrian's a prolific writer. Uh, this is his latest book on Osama bin Laden. The entire I would say 10 years in particular, from the time the World Trade Center was bombed until the time he was eliminated by the US SEALs. Both these books are available in the store. I'm not being paid to plug them.
He is.
You know, there's no time like the present. Both these books have relevance here and now. Sunetra, in her book, covered A. Raja, the telecom minister who was convicted and jailed in Tihar and has now been exonerated by the CBI court. I'd like very much to start with Sunetra, and by way of gender bias, I admit, to tell us what it is that she feels, given that Raja has been given a clean chit by the court.
So actually, you know, my book wasn't looking at the case as such. The idea for the book was basically because I met someone, this really amazing woman who was in jail. And she came out of jail and she called me and she told me these amazing stories about how she was wearing Louis Vuitton in jail, and how she was watching Orange is the New Black. It's this series which is about prisons in her LCD TV. And when she told me that, I was kind of surprised because I'd been a journalist for almost 2 decades and I'd never heard of someone doing that. Yeah, Anka Verma, yeah.
Anka Verma.
Who is an arms dealer's wife. So she'd gone to jail and she talked about how basically how she was using court orders to order the latest style of wedges and then also using court orders to get the right kind of toilet and basically a pretty comfortable life, even though she was really traumatized about it. So when that happened, I thought that there must be this entire breed of people in prisons everywhere, and we hear about the politicians, but we don't hear about a lot of the others and exactly what they do there. And if Anka was willing to talk about it, I thought there must be like lots of other people as well. So I went about systematically approaching all the people who spent time in jail. And this was a couple of years ago. So one of the people who, when you think about high-profile people going to jail, it all started with the 2G case, didn't it? I mean, that was the one which, for the first time, we saw a minister going to jail, a sitting minister going to jail for the telecom scam. And A. Raja kind of personified that, of someone being a powerful person, being part of the ruling party, and yet spending time in Tihar jail. So basically, I made a whole list of people who were influential like that and who'd gone to jail. Some of them didn't agree. For example, one of the other people I contacted was, Abu Salim, his girlfriend, Monica Bedi, who is now a Bollywood star. So I contacted her as well. But what happens is most people want to tell their own stories. They're all writing their own books. And
Which never come out.
yeah,
And,
exactly.
and
exactly.
even the Bengaliness didn't help with Subroto Roy, right?
No,
He just gave you Mishti Doi and Sandesh, but not the interview.
that's right, yeah. Exactly. Well,
No, but Sunetra,
actually, he said that he isn't a criminal like the rest of the people. But what my book,
but Sunetra, I'm sorry to be an NDTV anchor equivalent. Well, actually not NDTV, but some of the other anchors who interrupt. But while we'll get to the specifics, what I really want to understand from you, because you have this tremendous insight into Raja, right? I've read the interview that you had with him, and he has actually opened up and shared much of his pain and anguish, right? So given that, and particularly what happened, the turmoil that his daughter went through, his wife went through, he shared that with you in fairly abundant detail.
and he never talks about
Right,
it now.
and he doesn't talk about it anymore. He's kind of clammed up, and I don't think he's spoken about it since, right? So you have that rare insight into him. Given that, what do you think he's going through now that he's been given a complete clean chit by the court? That's really what when I said we'd like to first talk about the current and then go back to all the various instances that you have enumerated so very well in your book.
I think basically what one comes to understand is even if you spent only about 4 days, which Amar Singh had spent in jail, it changes you. It really changes you. And even if it is a life of comfort, so my book kind of documents what kind of comfort and all of that. But at the heart of it, it's also about how people in incarceration, which all of us seem to think, somebody was talking to me earlier and they said that, why would you want to write about this? Because people don't want to hear about people who are behind in jail. But I think when you read my book, I hope that you understand that even if somebody is criminal, they're also human beings, and you understand the kind of agony that they go through. So to come back to Raja, he was there for more than a year. And he believed from the word go that he was innocent, that he did this for this whole boom of the telecom sector. So you can imagine how he feels right now. He's been plotting his revenge, and so part of it is the book that he's done himself now. I don't think he wants to delve so much into the aspect that
Did he tell you that he'd be writing to Manmohan Singh and publicizing the letter?
No.
Right. If I
Yeah,
might,
sure.
so Adrian, coming to the present in your context, it's been in the news just yesterday that there's a swap or a possible swap or a discussion of a swap for Dr. Shakil Afridi and Afia Siddiqui. So the Americans want Dr. Shakil Afridi, who was the doctor who kind of gave the DNA sample, so to speak, of the family members that finally led to a finality on the identity of OBL being in Abbottabad, and this Pakistani American nuclear physicist of MIT fame who is incarcerated for 86 years and some in the US. So we'll start with that and then.
Oh, there's a lot to unpack there. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. It's really nice to be here. Just some little preliminary comments. I'm speaking for two people. So imagine there's two people here. I'm speaking for Kathy Scott Clark, who is the co-writer, and some of the best sections in this book have been done by her, and could only be done by her because they're interviews, very intimate interviews, in difficult situations with women where men aren't allowed, and where she could go with a niqab and some language and sit and spend months at a time to win confidences slowly. Incidentally, arrangements like that nowadays nearly all come about through social media. It's really quite unglamorous how it begins. It begins on WhatsApp and Telegram in Arabic. And because everybody spends all their time obsessed with Facebook and WhatsApp, including people who are the most wanted in the world, if you find the right way to discover who their avatar is, you can reach out, and they're nearly always online, even if it's a generator plugged in to keep their phone running in a field headquarters from an insurgent outfit. So that's one learning curve about how journalism is done. But to get to your question, there's so much in there that's wrong. It's difficult to know where to begin. I'll tell you why. To start with, those kind of swaps will never happen because one person has been convicted, and they've been convicted, whether or not fairly, in my opinion, unfairly, of an offence that may not have taken place in the case of the woman you're talking about. But they will not lift her out of the criminal justice system and hand her over for a doctor. And the doctor himself, there's so much myth created around this. He was, it's a terrible, tragic story. I don't know if people are aware that the Americans got inside an aid agency, and using that aid agency and the nurses and a doctor, they did blood test sampling in Abbottabad, looking to get some kind of genetic clues as to where Zama and his family were. And of course the doctor was an unwitting partner to this.
But there's not certainty on that, given that he was paid only $55,000 for his efforts. So
No, there's quite a
he
lot of
would have
certainty.
spelled some kind of rat, wouldn't he?
There's quite a lot of certainty. If you talk to his wife, he had an American visa which was active in his passport. He could have chosen to leave. He didn't leave because he didn't want to be seen to flee a country that he loves and which he considered to be his home. He could have evacuated his entire family out. He had 3 weeks' notice, and he could have done it. He chose to stay because he was guilty of no crime. And in fact, what happened after Osama bin Laden was captured, I don't know if people followed it, was that to cover up the embarrassment for what had happened, nearly everybody connected to Abbottabad vanished. So the guy cutting the trees, he vanished. The milkman vanished. The people who collected the rubbish vanished. All of the families that were connected to the families of the Guardians vanished. Most of what? Yeah. Yeah, we'll come to that. They weren't. No, those were ordinary citizens in Abbottabad. We'll get to the ISI involvement in a second, but we're not there yet. We're not there yet. Yeah, I'm definitely going in that direction, but not quite at the ISI stage. But if we just sort of step back one stage, I think a piece of connective tissue between both our books is people who have been through extraordinary experiences and telling their stories and finding reasons why. And perhaps I could explain that. I mean, I think, this is a terrific book, Behind Bars. And I think it's, again, a character-led book with people in extraordinary circumstances. And it's very revelatory about what humans do in extraordinary situations. And I think The Exile tried to start from the same vantage point. And if anyone's read the book we wrote called The Siege, it's very people-led as well. whether that be the insurgents themselves, the people from Lashkar-e-Toiba, understanding where their families came from in Bahawalpur, or whether it be the victims and survivors in the Taj. There's an attempt there to give a roundness, a 360-degree view of what turns someone into potentially the bearer of a suicide mission, and how do we survive in extremis when guns are firing and flames are wrapping around us. There are two sets of circumstances there. So that's the first thing, like people in extreme conditions. And why bother? Why bother to do this? I think you've said something I totally agree with. I think understanding people is the key, and particularly with a large, frightening subject like terror. Understanding what terror means and what terrorism means and what an insurgency means by getting to know people is probably the most important thing, because I don't know if you know that there's no established theory of terrorism. There's two profound studies that have been carried out, one in 1960s and one in 1981 by Crenfield. And those studies show you that most people who organise terror are totally normal. There is no type. If you say someone is a terrorist, it's not because they are a type, it's because they've committed acts of terror, and they're two different things. So that means you can't profile for terrorism. So there's no kind of person you're looking for. So we need to look much deeper than this. We need to look into causal relationships, what causes terror. And there are many different theories on this in terms of actual grievances that take place, as well as within a group, what people call devotional belief, the fact you can believe in something devotionally. So these are some of the reasons, putting a human face on something that's inaccessible, getting to the people behind issues that we bother to write The Exile. That's a bit of a speech. I think I'll cut off there. I'm on a monologue.
Adrian, that's very, very interesting, and you alluded to the previous book that you've written, which touches each one of us over here, which is Siege, pertaining to the Mumbai acts of terrorism. And in your book, you mentioned that there was a mole, perhaps in an Indian intelligence agency, Honeybee, right? And that kind of set everyone, alarm bells all over the place, particularly our agencies. Would you care to elaborate?
Yeah,
I know
that's a one line. Well, it was one line in a book which wasn't about Honeybee, but that line actually came from the intelligence services themselves, and then afterwards everyone got embarrassed. I was asked that when the book came out, and in fact, initially we were told not to tell anyone when we went to the intelligence service and to the government, to the Prime Minister's office, and said this appears to be the case, and you were confronted with this information by the Americans, and then subsequently we were told, well, we should print it because no one would say it officially, and that might elicit a response. So we did print it on the basis that we were told it was A, true, and B, that no one else would dare say it.
And we are still not sure about Honeybee's gender, so there can be no bias there,
no
right?
Idea. No gender bias, no. But
No
we
gender.
don't know. We don't know. But again, really, the Honeybee thing was irrelevant if you consider the bigger canvas. And the bigger canvas there was that the city knew what was coming. In the case, if I take myself back to that event, and for some reason, all of those clues were not processed correctly. Not that anyone can.
Yeah, apparently, 26 warnings from the CIA in different forms to the Indian government, right?
Yeah, they were very specific. Yeah.
So, Sunetra, in your book, you mention, by and large, right? I'm making a very by and large statement that if you have wealth and power, right, then you usually end up having a much better deal in prison. Right? That's very I'm not saying specifically, but if you go by Anka Verma or many of the others whom you have profiled, they end up being much better off, treated like the erstwhile category A prisoner. Why do you think, and this is not someone whom you've covered in your book, but why do you think someone like Rajan Pillai was not able to manage the system and died in prison, so to speak?
Because it can happen both ways. And one of the people covered in my book who is very rich and powerful but is still having a very raw deal is because they want to make an example of certain people. And I'm talking about Peter Mukherjee. Peter Mukherjee is someone who everyone in the CBI and everyone else seems to be getting a bit of a vicarious pleasure out of watching from outside. Look, he's the CEO, he's the media big guy who we've got now, so he's a great example to be made of. So they take amazing amounts of pleasure to tell reporters how they denied him a fish curry meal. See, one of the things that if you're a prisoner, if you go to an Indian jail is, and if you know the law, a lot of times that people who interact, they're fighting a huge case, then they become kind of semi-lawyers themselves. And the reason for that is that a lot of lawyers tend to take you for a ride. So people tend to read up on the laws so that they can help themselves. Because if you read your laws, then you know there are provisions for everything. One of the reasons that Anka got all these provisions is not just because she's rich, it's because she read the jail manual, which says that you have the right to maintain yourself. And it's how you interpret that. So if you're educated and if you're articulate, if you have a good representation, then you can go to court and say that I'm used to a certain life and I need that and it's my right as an individual, and you quote those documents and you can do that. So everybody else does that. All the netas, a part of the VIP treatment is also because they're educated and they claim this for themselves. Peter Mukherjee tried to get the same thing. So he said he has a medical condition, so he needs food from home, because obviously the jail food is atrocious. And jail conditions for people who the government wants to make an example of can be terrible. For example, G. Sai Baba, who is accused of being a Maoist, is 90% disabled. Most of the time he's lying on the floor because the wheelchair access is so bad, so he's crawling on the floor. And these are things that we don't want to come to terms with. We don't want to hear, because who wants to hear about those kind of conditions? And we justify it in our head because we think, okay, they've done terrible things, so they're going through these terrible things. But it also, what I really wanted this book to do is also make us aware that these things are happening in our jails. And Peter Mukherjee, to come back to that, is rich, and yet when his family got food for him in the prison, someone can just act as, the thing about jails is it gives a huge amounts of power to even the smallest jailer. So the person he has an order which says that he can have home food because he's ill, but the jailer that day decided, I want to harass him. I didn't like the channel. I don't like the fact that he might take a moralistic position. What was he doing with a younger woman? What was he doing having a second wife? Because if you read the CBI's charge sheet, it's also a moral, it's a moral judgment being passed. It says things like, she was very friendly and made friends with another person, another young man, or something like that. So it doesn't just delve on investigative aspects. It makes a moral. It takes a moral position on people. So the jailer that day in court took a moral position that Peter Mukherjee deserved worse. So despite the fact that he's really well off and he could have paid off people, that day he felt very important, that jailer, denying him his fish curry and rice, and made sure he told the reporters attending court that he cried for this food. And that's one of the things that A. Raja says to me as well. That A. Raja said that all of these people who were there, all of these, Sanjay Chandra, the Reliance people who all went to jail, he said what was amazing. He goes, look, I'm a politician. I go out there to villages. I've seen the rough side. So I'm used to roughing it out. These industrialists are not used to roughing it out. Apparently, one of the most toughest days for them was one day when the jailer didn't allow them food from home. Same thing. So when people talk about torture, it's not just whippings that they get, which they do get, or being stripped or being paraded naked, which happens in jails. One of the most, if you ask any famous person, what is the worst thing, and he'll tell you how one day he could see his family with the food. And these are all very influential people, but the jailer that day decided, for his kicks, I'm not going to go by the court order which allows them home food. I'm going to deny them and make sure they suffer. So he talks about the time that all these rich people one day went without one lunch, which seems like nothing, but it's just that power thing, that somebody has the power to tell you, you cannot go to the toilet, you cannot go there, I'm going to make you starve all day, I'm going to have you, locked up in a van, which is like a jail thing all day, things like that, little cruelties which even the rich have to go through.
Sunetra, I'll respectfully disagree with you. on the food path, and this is another common thread between both your books.
No, it's not my opinion.
No,
These are things which
sure,
happen.
of course. No, I'm not.
Yeah.
But if you read Adrian's book, which I'd recommend for you to do,
No, I've read it. Yeah.
the thing that I find, the thread that I find common in terms of humiliating an individual most is the loo part, right? You've mentioned it.
Yeah.
You mentioned the goo that JP had to deal with, and Adrian has mentioned the loo aspect in Cat's Eye in Thailand or Guantanamo, and apparently that's the most demeaning thing that these people have to do. It's not just the stripping, but when they have to defecate or urinate in a place which is dirty. I think people who are white collared, I think that probably impacts them the most. What's your take, Adrian? You've referred to this in some detail.
I think in the case of torture, it's quite difficult to know where to begin with this subject. I discovered with Kathy in the process of researching the book a bit more of an intimate view of what the American enhanced interrogation program might actually mean. There were diaries written by people who were held, and the diaries were written on the orders of the psychologists who were contracted to make the program work, and they wanted to use them as clinical tools. So they said to the prisoners, please write a daily diary after the treatment, the enhanced interrogation session. And then the psychologists would take the diary away and look how they could tweak the torture program, as it's now become known, to see whether or not it was effective or ineffective. And the detainees would use the diary in order to get some sense of themselves back, and to hopefully use it as a corroborative record of what they'd been through. I'm talking about Abu Zubaydah, who was the patient zero, the first person to put through it. But in fact, it wasn't just him. Of the 118 people who were put forward through this program, I think at least half, they used the same clinical tool. And what you discover when you go through this program, in fact, there's a whole history of the medicalization of interrogation procedures. You discover that it goes and starts years back with attempts to protect American airmen and special forces during the Korean War, who were crash landing their planes or shot down by the Chinese and the Koreans, and then were put through terrible interrogations in which they were made and used as propaganda vehicles for different nation states. And so the government ordered a program be created which would be a counter-interrogation program. It's called the SEER program. That program then was tweaked and honed through the Vietnam War, and the whole point of it was the science was applied to make you resist. And then after 9/11 happened, a group of scientists who were really involved in SEER, at the center of SEER, came to the CIA and said, can we reverse engineer this program for SEER and then make a program that stopped people talking, make people talk? Kind of a weird way of looking at the program. And so they put together various kinds of things that you would have read about, including waterboarding, which is only one element. The most common view by the American Psychologists Association and by the Feinstein Committee that looked into it is that all of these programs created false leads, and apart from dehumanizing and being degrading and illegal and immoral, if we get all of that to one side, they also produce no actionable intelligence that anyone can discern. And that process of attenuation, which is what it is, the process of being stripped of your dignity and your sense of self, is extraordinary. In 16 years, Abu Zubaydah's been seen by his lawyers only. In 16 years, he's appeared once in public only. When the lawyers go in every 6 weeks, he sits on the floor shackled by his hands and feet. This is a man who's not been charged. Presently, there's a habeas corpus action that's brought in the federal court in America, because after 16 years, if you can't proffer evidence to charge, then something needs to happen. So I think it was one of the most ghoulish discoveries of the book, was the true human impact of that kind of program and how misguided it was, when in fact the guilty, the people who actually did plot 9/11 and other events, themselves have been caught up in the illegality of Guantanamo Bay. Their trials, their hearings, they're not trials, are, if anyone follows the news, are taking place now, and they may never actually complete. And so the people who committed these offences may actually never be tried, and the wrong people who were tortured are now all suing the government and accusing them of war crimes. 118 cases, in fact.
So Sunetra, you mentioned Sai Baba being given a very, very difficult time in prison. And
He's not in my book, but yeah.
he's not in your book, but you mentioned in the course of your talk now. And you also mentioned Kobad Gandhi being given a very, very difficult time and not being allowed some basic amenities which he might be given, the state of his health being perilous. So would you say, and you know, in light of what Adrian mentioned, would you say political prisoners have a much tougher time?
Yeah, I mean, you know what Adrian was saying, like waterboarding and all, we've all heard about, and it's been documented. But you also hear, like, you know, how they kind of adapted to local situations and sensibilities. So in Wahid's chapter, he talks about the 7/11, the Mumbai train blasts, all the accused who are now facing death penalty. And he talks about, you know, you talk about how people are tortured in order to get information. None of these people, how they would pressurize them into signing the confession statement would be things like bringing in their sister-in-law, and you know, they would be stripped naked and then bringing in their sister-in-law, and that being the huge pressure point, you know. So they were all beaten, but this would also be done. So the suggestion of what they could do with your female relatives in the court. But these are extreme forms, but there are also everyday forms of torture which when you speak to people, they tell you about. Because one interesting, you know, somebody just came out of prison and they read the book in prison, so Mahmood Farooqi actually, and he told me that you must, everywhere you go, please talk about it, Sunetra. So apparently, you know, you can lose your mind with things like this. And in the entire Tihar jail, there's only one psychiatrist. There's only one mental health professional. There are thousands and thousands of people. There are about 10,000 people there, and there's only one doctor you can see for how you're feeling. So, and one of the smaller ways that they harass you is that the light never goes off. And they all talk about it. People who they talk about the kind of, and that's a form of torture internationally. It's a known form of torture. But in the name of safety, there's a huge bright light which is always shining in your cell. And some of the people who are influential enough, they paint that black in order to get away with that. But you know, all of this kind of adds up to the kind of, so even if you're not, you're not waterboarded, or your female relatives are not, these little cruelties are all over. And Kobart's was extreme. He's 70 years old, and Ansal's weren't sent to prison because the Supreme Court said they're too old. And while that's being done with Ansal, so that's another form of how the rich get away.
And Ansal's only 68.
That's right. So Ansal, who is responsible for the death of 52 people, including most of them children, they've stayed out of jail. And Kobad Gandhi, who's been acquitted by 2 jails, and for being some kind of an ideologue, that apparently his speeches inspired people to commit acts of Maoist acts. So he's supposed to be the inspiration. So while he's not done anything directly, and he's been acquitted by all courts, 2 of them, and you know, they've just keep putting one case after the other. And as a 70-year-old, it's not torture per se, but look at this. Every month he has to single-handedly pick up all his stuff, and you know, because they'll say, oh, it's a security check and you're a security threat. So they'll come and he'll have to lift all his heavy stuff and walk out, and then they'll do a search. So this happens every week or every month, and he's harassed in that way, or they move him to another jail. So these are everyday acts of torture that they inflict on someone who is 70 and suffering and ill, and his medicines, you know, that's a huge problem as well. So it's insane knowing that our state, which on paper has all the right kind of laws and humanitarian aspects are taken care of, but when you really look at it, it really doesn't translate.
That's a really good point. I think that actually might be the kind of central thesis of why I bother to write a book inside bin Laden's family. because ostensibly you could say that these guys have been put through the system, you know, they are abhorrent, they are people you may not be able to empathise with, but actually there's so little really known about those missing spaces, whether it's inside a prison when the door locks, when the ward door locks, or inside an insurgent or terrorist movement. And what's reported in nearly all those cases is either factually inaccurate, a trope, or it's provided by the state as a press release. And so finding alternative sources in an age where facts are in short supply is really, really important. And often that means going to the source itself. So in your case, being with people who are inside jails or with their family and finding that fingertip feeling. And in our case, with trying to get inside a movement that so far has not told the story from within. And we kind of had like a slightly weak metaphor for this, a kind of an image for it. And we called it the North Korean balcony scenario, because if you look at reporting on North Korea, it's mostly mocking in tone, and it mostly refers to a short, fat guy with a predilection for baggy, it is a proxy war, baggy suits and a bad haircut. No one can name anyone in the balcony. No one can name any of their relationships even, or very few people can. And that lack of detail, that lack of nuance, is actually creating far more conflict. It makes conflict easier to happen. And I believe that's actually the essence, whether it's in the micro with a prison or with an insurgent movement.
And thank God, Adrian, you're asking all those questions, because, you know, there's one thing which made me, because you don't do daily stories anymore.
No.
I do daily stories, and it actually made me ashamed of the kind of work we were doing. And I want to know, how do we, I know you're saying that, you know, you have to go to the source. That's basically the aspect of it. Because one of the people, Wahid, who is actually that 7/11 terror suspect, he got acquitted after 10 years. And this keeps happening, right? You see these people who go into jail. There was this young MA student who came out of jail after 12 years. He was an MA student, and now he's 40, and now he doesn't know what to do with his life. And, you know, and he said that how could you not ask those basic questions? And what was the basic question was, he said, which terror suspect, right? And it was so easy when you look at it, but all of us missed it. Which terror, which is all the 7/11 people, which terror suspect, after the blast that they apparently committed, sat at home and then went to the police station every day for questioning and then was arrested a month later? Has this happened? And this is the simple question he asked me. And all of us, because he was in Mumbai, this wasn't happening in Gadchiroli, in Maharashtra, some, you know, godforsaken place where media, this was happening in Mumbai. All of these people who were arrested for the 7/11 blast, they were appearing for questioning every single day. They were coming at 9 in the morning, leaving at 5 p.m. And then the police had the audacity to say, we have caught the people who've done 7/11. And none of us asked the question, but sir, how did you suddenly realize after 2 months, what were you doing for 2 months?
But Sunetra, does that mean that the legal system fails them?
No, we failed them.
No, you know, whether
we failed them not
but
asking the questions.
They also have lawyers who would pretty much, you know, of course we as a collective whole have failed them. I don't deny that responsibility from all of us, but they also engage lawyers. Is something as basic that comes to you or any other journalist, or something that Walid himself asks?
It's beyond that. It's actually beyond that. I think exactly what you're referring to. The system itself is broken, fundamentally broken. And what I mean by that is that the pact of honesty is broken. The pact of honesty between governments, newspapers, and readers and people and viewers is broken. People do not know what to trust. I mean, there's a really brilliant survey done 2 days ago, I think. You can check it out, just Google it, which looked at people's responses now to news processed via social media. It's really interesting, actually, through being alerted to Russian intervention in who knows what, but potentially Brexit and definitely Trumpism.
This is part of the fake news dilemma,
The fake news dilemma. So the interesting thing of that is that, as you know, newspaper subscriptions have actually, for the first time ever, gone up. People are looking for expert knowledge when newspapers for years have been sacking expert knowledge. And the interesting thing is that paid news, which is what newspapers mostly do now, sponsored news, is the opposite of what actually people are looking for. And I give one other example of this. If I think about my son, who's 13, and he's researching on his homework, he seamlessly moves through YouTube and news channels, and comes back to me with 19 sources, all of which are either fictional or wrong. And actually, that's a 13-year-old boy in the education system. For adults too, it's a vexatious time when websites are created to deliberately undermine truths, and politicians and governments stoke that and use it to their advantage. Exactly as you pointed out with the 7/7 and highly charged cases. And it's happened in the case of Al-Qaeda. Just to throw in one fact about the book here. An interesting thing when you actually get inside a movement that doesn't want reporting is you discover all sorts of things which are not true, even the most basic things about who's married to who and who had what kids. But actually, even more fundamentally...
Osama would have made it difficult with 6 wives, right?
Two of whom he divorced. Yeah.
No, two of whom he divorced, right?
Yeah. He did have a large number of people. But if you see it as a Russian novel, it is quite easy to remember them if you keep a note. But the point here is that even some of the basic structure that surrounds a story like this is wrong. So when you're inside the movement, what you learn straight away, for example, is that Al-Qaeda as a group had rejected 9/11. They rejected the plan. They held a Shura meeting. They were like a corporation. And they said, actually, no, we don't want to do that. It will lead to the destruction of Afghanistan. And he did it anyhow, hiring a psychopath from Baluchistan who was outside the organization and thought he could do it.
Sure.
But the reason I give that as an illustration is that real contemporary history, real focused, sharp journalism is going to push back on those memes, on those internet generalizations, which are spurious, nearly all of them, and try and get to the truth, whether it is on a specific case or on a conspiracy. It's harder and harder. You said to me when we met and chatted, there's not money in it. Every time you're critical, the government's on the phone to you saying, why us now? You didn't do this with them, and actually you did do it with them, but they've forgotten. It's hard right now to report. It can even be a fatal experience, as we know, both in India and particularly in Pakistan right now, where journalists are falling over like 9 pins. But truth should become part of the pivot of this discussion, and how we find it and what we need to bolster to know what's real.
Should we get the audience to ask some questions? Sir, you wanted to ask? You were saying... can we get the gentleman a mic?
Adrian, I wanted to ask you a very simple...
Sir, we can't hear you.
Hello, I wanted to ask you a very simple question. Somebody who's been convicted and put in jail should not be tortured, because there is a period prior to that when you can torture him to get to the truth, right? And there's a certain period when you are a remand prisoner in the police station, when they can question you and get the truth out of you. But
so what's your question?
the question is, when you're in jail, you have already been convicted. So...
No, not true, sir, because you can be an under trial also in jail, as happens in India most of the time. If you look at many of the instances that Sunetra has mentioned,
Yeah.
they are under trials languishing in jail.
In jail.
Right, so Peter Mukherjee has not been convicted, Walid was not convicted, but they were languishing in jail and being tortured. So,
but there are other questions as well. You cannot be tried.
yeah, one question per person, sir, please. Yeah, sir.
I would like to ask these questions to both the authors. Namely, what is the ethical position of the contention that those who believe in extremity, in extreme methods, such as terrorists, having no regard to human life and values as practiced since God knows how long, what is this contention says that they should be given the right that civilized people, civilizations, civilized people, civilized societies grant to the under trials or the convicts, as the case may be, in their society. So the position is very simple.
I've understood what you're
Do
saying.
they forfeit all?
I've understood what you're
No, no.
saying. I've understood. I think there's just two quick responses to that, really. One is that we have to differentiate ourselves from the people who are basically, mounting terror. And if we and meet terror with terror, we can see what the consequences of that are. It's effectively a cult of death that's operating at the moment. And if a cult of death is met by another cult of death, we have a death spiral where nothing ever gets to the curative stage. Right now, we're in that death spiral. We haven't attempted to interdict it. There is no practicing counter-terrorism strategy that is working, or counter-radicalisation strategy that is working. If you Google right now New Scientist and terror, there's a fantastic piece written by scientists on the bankruptcy of counter-terrorism and counter-terrorism, counter-radicalisation. I'm really recommending reading it. It's 2,500 words. It's brilliantly sourced because it's bringing a scientist's mind, and it comes from inside, people who work inside Pentagon. And if you begin to look at that, you'll understand why we're in that death spiral, and it will actually answer the very root of that question. Illegality like Guantanamo eroded confidence in America before Trump came in. It eroded confidence. Fighting wars on false premises like Iraq, blaming Iraq for fostering WMD and fostering Al-Qaeda when they did neither, and in that instance, that eroded and then triggered the consequences of what happened. That's not to say that there weren't organisations that existed prior to that committed huge acts of violence, but I really recommend that New Scientist piece. It'll only take an hour of your time, and you'll get to some of the reasoning behind it.
Adrian, one specific question which will be of great interest to an Indian audience is the role of the ISI in protecting Osama, in particular the S-wing. Right, so if you look at both the S-wing, which is an ISI within an ISI, a law unto themselves, and the ISI. So
well, the whole thing's a ball of wool, so it's quite hard to differentiate one part from another. And there's a jihad factory which is also used by ISI, so Lashkar-e-Toiba and all those groups you're all very familiar with here. So it's an exercise in a deliberate lack of oversight, in the sense that no one really wants to look too deeply into who's running who. That makes it difficult to comment on accurately, other than taking very, very specific individual cases. I certainly believe that it's proven almost that institutionally they may not have known, but they did create a cape of invisibility around Osama and his family. And that was created using jihad fronts and other organisations at arm's length that created terror. But they're not the only state to do that. Other states have done the same.
But would you say that someone like General Hamid, who was the erstwhile head of ISI, would you say that he had planted his people within the S-wing who believed in his diktat and ideology, and therefore continued to do whatever it is that he wished them do?
Yeah, I don't think it works like that. Those people have been in office for 30 years. They're now indivisible from the outfits they ran. But what you learn when you're in Pakistan is there's those people who operate in that environment, and then there are people who are trying to carve out the middle-class civil space. They're also under siege. They're under siege from the military intelligence deep state that is chipping away, that is in charge of encounters and forced disappearances. It's a terrible situation that they're in right now. Political paralysis only has strengthened the hand of the military. But anyhow, it's not all bad news. This is like a doom and gloom ending to this, but actually it's not all bad news. There's revelatory information that's coming out. A lot of citizen power to resist what's happening in Pakistan is slowly coming to the fore. If you look at the shoot to kill episode that's taken place in Karachi, have a little look at that. There's a really interesting thing involving Pashtuns, where they were set up and killed as members of the TTP, the Pakistan Taliban. And this people's movement leapt up and resisted that event. And now the SSP, in charge of many, many, many encounters, was caught yesterday trying to run away on the plane to Dubai. He said he was actually going shopping and not running away. But the fact that that could happen, and the FIA, the Federal Investigation Authority, felt empowered to nab Amin, is a good thing. And that became because of legal activism, because of things that are happening amongst aware citizens. So it's not all bad news.
The lady...
Yes, good afternoon, everybody.
Afternoon.
My question is to Sunetra. Sunetra, you have interviewed many people. I'm very interested to know whether you have interviewed Nirbhaya's rapists.
No, I haven't, because my book came after the MHA advisory, which stopped basically raised red flags, and no one was, because they were interviewed by the BBC documentary filmmaker, and
Right.
after that, and also one of the other things was that I don't know whether that was the right way or not, but basically I needed to empathize with all the people who were in my book,
Okay.
and I don't know that, so I didn't really seek them out as well. You know what I'm saying? That the characters in my book needed to be people that I was
You
yeah,
empathized with.
yeah, and I don't know if I
Yes.
could.
I get it.
So a
Thank
follow up to that,
Yes.
Sunetra, is the reform movement that Kiran Bedi ostensibly started in Tihar. I don't think you're very clear. You don't enunciate very clearly, or you don't seem very impressed, if I might say. So, do you think it was more publicity and a build-up rather than things actually happening in Tihar by way of reform?
No, actually, one of my subjects talks a great deal and is really the Tandoor murderer is very impressed.
But I'm very impressed with you. You go out to American Diner at Habitat with him.
Yeah. No, so he was really, really impressed, the Tandoor murderer, with what Kiran Bedi had done. And he gave instances of how she changed his life. For example, the no smoking thing, no tobacco thing. It actually made Tihar cleaner, because he said that, it would be full of phlegm and spit. You couldn't step out before Kiran Bedi. And
Even the Vipassana, I think, was her idea, wasn't it?
yes, but unfortunately, Vipassana was now being used as a pad for people who wanted to have a good time. So Kalmadi apparently was in constant Vipassana. Well, I'm sure he was speaking, but Kalmadi apparently never came out of the Vipassana hall because it was the most comfortable. So he stayed there. The 2.5 years that he spent in prison, he stayed in Vipassana. So that was obviously an abuse of power. It wasn't what Kiran Bedi meant it to be. But some of the things, I think Kiran Bedi was the last person who paid attention to jails. So it was a punishment posting that she had, but she made something of it. I think everybody else looks at it as, will I then become the commissioner of police or not? They don't look at it as, I'm going to do some prison reform.
And sadly, she didn't, right? She went to the Bureau of Police Research. So you wish.
My question is that what foolproof solution comes out without torturing a hardcore offender to speak the truth?
Just please spend 5 minutes and Google New Scientist and counter-terrorism. It'll just take an hour of your time, and have a look where we're up to on torture right now. And if you look at all of the legal documents that have come to the fore with the Abu Zubaydah case, which is ongoing in America, you'll look at those documents, because the internal documents that have been made available by discovery by the ACLU in America, the Civil Rights Union in America, the pro bono lawyers, the internal documents throw huge doubt on the information that came as a result of torture. In fact, their critique of it, just on that ground alone, is quite interesting to read. But beyond that, let's just stick to what is also moral, what is legal. I think we're missing those points too. It is immoral and illegal, and we are signatories to a whole host of international regulations. For that reason, it is immoral and it is illegal.
Also, sir, most people go back on it. I mean, if you look at all these cases, why they're falling is because they were tortured into saying something, and when actually the judge wants to listen to you, and when they do, then most people say, I didn't make that statement, and they just
But
they
then,
go back
Sunetra,
I
it's
think
inadmissible
so there's no
in
point
court.
in
No,
that.
but
Sorry?
it's mostly, other than to some statutory judges,
Yeah.
most of these confession statements are inadmissible in court,
Well,
which
there
is why
are-
Walid got off. His brother-in-law
No,
recanted, right?
because Wahid got
Right.
The thing is, they have perfected this art of making it look legit. Wahid got off because he didn't sign the confession statement. Everybody else who did, because nobody else is interested in these people, they are being, they face the death penalty because nobody's interested in them.
But
And they
we've
don't
also,
want-
can I just say that when I listen to this debate, we have.
I'm being warned.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
being
We just
warned
want,
by
but
two
I just
charming
wanna-
ladies on
that's
both
fine.
sides.
Just
So-
finish with one point here. I think we need to decide whether we want justice or vengeance. Just think of that. Do you want justice or vengeance? Do you want to know the truth, or are you so afraid of the truth you want to hurt someone as a result? You decide on which one of those you want. If you want things to stop and get better, we have to get to the nub of the truth. We have to get inside the mind of someone who's doing this, and I appeal for more humanity in that sense, and less vengeance. Vengeance just elongates
and
these movements.
one of the ways of vengeance, Adrian, was these people told me, you asked about the December 16th rapists and murderers. So apparently the way of their form of justice and torture is that they also got raped by the other inmates of the Har. I don't think that we want that kind of torture. I mean, that's what happened.
So on that,
The rapists were
sir.
raped by the other inmates of the jail.
So on that note, justice or vengeance, can we put our hands together for Adrian and Sunetra? Thank you very much.
Apologies for having to play the bouncer yet again. The next session, we are ready with the next session. We just take a couple of minutes to rearrange the stage, and we'll be ready to welcome Jeet Tayal and Shondeep Roy to discuss Book of Chocolate Saints, which is Jeet's new book. The authors will be signing, as always, copies of their books at our bookstore. And you're welcome to quickly go there and come back if you so wish. Or signed books will be available later. Thank you for your patience. We'll be ready with Jeet and Sandeep very soon.